This is called Gold Fever, California's Gold Rush, written by Carl Nolte. It says, Goethe once wrote, "The best thing which we derive from history is the enthusiasm that it raises in us." Sacramento and its people absolutely personify that observation. As a city, county, and region composed of dozens of cultures, we've recognized our shared heritage, though occasionally have fallen short of commemorating and celebrating our ethnicity. That has begun to change in the past few years. Through productive new collaborations, alliances among private and public sectors, as well as positive activism, community leaders and area residents who've seen the value of embracing the totality and differences of our history, we've come to realize a deceptively simple fact: the best for our future prosperity may very well reside in our colorful past. And, at the beginning of this new century, diverse group of Sacramento stakeholders came together to create the first regional heritage tourism summit. The goals were to break down cultural barriers and to cross county and city lines in the creation of bringing together people, programs, and activities that would acknowledge the glories and challenges that surrounded the birth of latter-day Sacramento right here in 1848. It is shown here how a series of events more than a century and a half ago inspired the multifaceted dream that became California. Today we remain the most complex state in the nation. Sacramento, the microcosm and impetus of so much California history, remains one of its profound treasures. In a very real sense, our gold rush and our heritage are alive and well. Written by Steve Hammond, President, CEO of Sacramento Convention and Visitors Bureau. SCVB at cityofsacramento.org, 1-800-292-2334. So the Gold Fever, California's Gold Rush. Butte, Sutter, Yuba, El Dorado, Sacramento, Yola, Napa, Solano, Sonoma, Marin, Contra Costa, Santa Clara, Mariposa, Tulum, San Joaquin, Calaveras, Monterey, San Francisco, Branchiforte, that's the whole mining district, so-called mining district. California is a place of golden sunshine, big mountains, towering trees, tall stories, some of them true. It began as a legend. The first known mention of California in a 16th century Spanish book was a report of a fantastic island very near the terrestrial paradise ruled by the goddess Califia and inhabited by Amazons. Their arms are all of gold, as is the harness of the wild beast they ride. In all the island there is no other metal. Of course, California is no island and there are no Amazons, but the legend of a golden land turned out to be reality. American California was born and gold developed instantly in an amazing mass migration called the Gold Rush. The sudden boom of those days transformed Northern California, the Motherlode, and the Sacramento Valley, and turned tiny settlements on the Sacramento River and San Francisco Bay into cities almost overnight. Before the gold rush began in 1849, California was a sleepy pastoral spot at the far end of the world. There was not a single building between Sacramento and the Great Salt Lake. By the fall of 1850, California was the 31st of the United States, and by 1854, Sacramento was its capital, the seat of government of the Golden State. Today, 34 million people live in California. It is the largest state in the country, a land of limitless horizons. If it were a country, its economy would rank 5th in the world. Sacramento is at its center, a city of tall buildings and tree-lined streets in the middle of the state's great Central Valley. California's glitter is in Los Angeles and Hollywood. Much of its style is in San Francisco, but its heartland is in the Sacramento Valley. Sutter's Fort and the Gold Country just beyond is where American California began. A 1950 postage stamp commemorating the California Gold Rush Centennial. The ultimate tool of the gold miners, the pan, with a few nuggets of gold on it. This tool was where the prospector placed all of his hopes. In an exquisite Chinese chest in 1875 with a fanciful view of America, complete with Indians pursuing buffalo across the plains. And the map is of the original mining districts of California in 1851. The Old Spanish and Mexican California is along the El Camino Real, from San Diego north through Santa Barbara and up a trail of 21 missions to Sonoma. But the province of Alta California was in decline by the late 1830s. The Spanish and Mexican governments had never been able to establish much more than a foothold on the land. The Europeans had come in 1769, and after 70 years of their rule, only 7,500 people of European descent, fewer than the present population of Sausalito, lived in an area as big as France. The interior of this vast land, just beyond the Coast Range and the great Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, was claimed by Mexico, but in fact was held by Native American tribes. There were about 150,000 Native Americans in California, but about half the population of California before the Europeans came. So, okay, they were half the population before the Europeans. 150,000 Native Americans. The rest had died of diseases imported from Europe, or from the impact of their contact with the European civilization, which destroyed their culture and scattered their families. The landscape of Golden California painted in 1861. Browers, south of Toon City. In the Sacramento and San Joaquin Valley, a great smallpox epidemic had disseminated the Indian population in the winters of 1833 and 34. The native people were weakened, and there were not enough Hispanic Californians to move into the center of the country. In fact, the Spanish and Mexicans had very little knowledge of the interior and of California. Otto von Kotzebue, a German in the service of the Russian Navy, had sailed up the Sacramento River in 1823, and Jedediah Smith, the American fur trapper, had camped on the banks of what he called the Wild River, not long afterwards. Shown is in 1850, a Californian Indian. When the gold rush began, there were 150 native Californians. By 1860, only 36,000 were left. The Spanish came to California for the greater glory of God and for land. These crucifixes were used by missionaries at Carmel in the 1790s. So they brought the European diseases that killed the Native Americans. The British explorer Edward Belcher said the Spanish missionaries had told him about a river they called the Rio Grande, which flowed into San Francisco Bay from the north. This river, the missionaries say, is the finest in the world. Belcher wrote, navigable by the largest vessels at the same time. The banks are fruitful, the climate is mild. In this country, in the summer of 1839, just 10 years before the gold rush, came a Swiss adventurer named John Augustus Sutter. That's him. John Sutter, in the uniform of a general of the California militia, a great man before the discovery of gold, a pooper afterward. The Mexicans who called themselves Californians were famous as horsemen. The set of silver inlaid spurs was worn by well-off rancheros, who were the lords of the land in pre-American times. Sutter, who had abandoned his family in Europe, came to the West to make his fortune. He had heard of the great Sacramento Valley and saw it as a place where he could found an empire built on enterprise and hard work. He arrived in the old Mexican capital of Monterrey in July 1839. With a few followers, letters of introduction to Governor Juan Alvarado, and a plan. He told the governor he wanted to colonize land along the Sacramento River. The governor was impressed with Sutter and his idea. He had been worried about the wilderness at the heart of California. He told Sutter he could explore the rivers and colonize any land pleasing to him. If in a year Sutter had established a settlement, he was to return to Monterey and apply for a grant of land. Sutter went to San Francisco, got letters of credit, chartered 2 small sailing vessels and a rowboat, signed on 13 men, and set sail up the bay. The land was so little known that it took the party 8 days to find the entrance to the Sacramento River. They sailed upstream, then turned up the American River and landed at what is now the foot of 28th Street in Sacramento. It was August 12, 1839, the beginning of modern San Francisco, and according to the historian Richard Dillon, the beginning of what became American California. 3 of the 6 European followers thought that the land was so promising that they sailed back to San Francisco. But Sutter left with 10 Hawaiians, an Indian, 3 Europeans, and a pet dog, fired a cannon salute to the departing vessel, startling and amazing crowds of Indians and herds of wild elk and deer. Great clouds of birds flew about, and wolves and coyotes began to howl. William Heath Davis, the skipper of Sutter's little fleet, said the salute was the first echo of civilization in the primitive wilderness that soon would be populated and become a great agricultural and commercial center. Sutter built a single building, and then a fort, and then an empire. Governor Alvarado gave him a grant of 11 Spanish leagues, or 76 square miles. Sutter called it New Helvetia after his native Switzerland. By 1841, he had welcomed the first wagon train from the United States. By 1845, Sutter had a huge farming and livestock operation, using Indians as workers. So here is after he lost his Sacramento property, John Sutter moved to his Hawk Farm on the Feather River. Within a few years, he had lost even that. Okay. Anywho, he even had a 200-man army of uniformed Indians who marched to a fife and drum corps. The figure in the foreground is believed to be James Marshall at the sawmill in Coloma a few years after the discovery of gold. Though a fairly modern sawmill for its time, it produced very little milled lumber. It fell into disrepair and was later abandoned. In 1846, he heard in horror of the Donner wagon train trapped in the early winter snows in the Sierra and sent help. Etc. He was the master of the land. I was everything, he said, patriarch, priest, father, and judge. In 1846, the year Bernard DeVoto called the year of decision, American settlers who had poured into the empty land, California, revolted at Sonoma, declared California an independent republic, and raised the bear flag. They captured General Mariano Vallejo, the Mexican commandant, and imprisoned him at Sutter's Fort. Events that summer moved very quickly. The United States went to war with Mexico, and the U.S. Navy seized California. On July 11, 1846, the Stars and Stripes were raised over Sutter's Fort. Sutter saw a great future for California under American rule. He wanted to build a city and name it for himself, Sutterville, it was to be called. To produce lumber for the town, he hired a man named James Wilson Marshall and a crew of Mormons to build a sawmill at a place the Indians called Coloma. One chilly January morning, Marshall, worried that some work that had not been done properly, set out walking to make an inspection. His job was to make sure that water diverted from the South Fork of the American River would turn the water wheel and drive the mill's machinery. Glancing into the water, Marshall spotted a brilliant golden rock glittering on the bottom. He picked it up, examined it, rolled it between his fingers. It made my heart thump, he wrote later, for I was sure it was gold. Marshall rushed to the others in the crew. "Gold, boys, gold," he yelled. "My God, I believe I have found a gold mine." 4 days later, he went to Sutter's fort to tell Sutter himself what he had found. Sutter wanted to keep the discovery a secret, but of course he could not. When the word got out, it set off a huge rush to California, the largest mass migration in American history, according to historian Michael Kowalski. People came from all over the world. California's population jumped in 6 years to 300,000, and the tiny port of San Francisco became the 10th largest city in the United States. In 1848, January, James Marshall, who discovered the first gold, used his hammer. However, Marshall never found gold again and died broke. This lithograph, reproduced from a painting by William S. Jewett in 1851, represents a very romantic view of Coloma, Sutter's Mill, and the surrounding expanse of the valley. Sacramento went from a population of 150 in April of 1849 to 3,500 7 months later, to perhaps 10,000 by the end of the year. For a time, San Francisco was the largest city on the American West Coast, and Sacramento was the second largest. The gold rush was an amazing event. The new Californians, calling themselves 49ers, built 100 mining camps, dug up the country, gouged the hills, diked the rivers, and changed the place forever. They also despoiled the land, shot the peaceful Indians living in California, and exterminated the wild game. It was a reckless and dangerous time. The sudden boom, the big transformation of California, and the development of the new technology was to be repeated over and over throughout the state's history. The gold rush, said historian Kevin Starr, is part of the DNA of California. The gold miners did not make California, but the gold rush led to the growth of the service industries. The miners had to be fed, supplied, housed, and transported to the gold fields. Gold lured Levi Strauss, and he sold the miners' pants. Levi's, they were called. In Sacramento, where the river boats docked and all roads led to El Dorado, merchants sold picks and shovels to the miners. Collis P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins opened a hardware store a block off the river and made a fortune. Later, with San Francisco merchants Charles Crocker and Leland Stanford, they built the first transcontinental railroad, founded banks, and launched a great university. But that was all later. At first, not many people believed in gold. The dream of every Argonaut was the gold strike, gold for the taking. These large, heavy nuggets were thought to be easily found along the banks of the Sacramento River. The CAM Tabor, the whaling ship captain, arrived in San Francisco about the time of gold discovery. By his own account, he went to the Yolo side of the Sacramento River, set up an easel, and sketched this view of the landing of Sacramento. The building in the center is the Hensley Reading Store. The left side at the sandbar is about the foot of I Street. View of Sutter's Mill, or place where the first gold has been discovered. A portrait of Mr. Marshall taken from nature at the time when he made the discovery of gold in California. Captain Sutter's account of the first discovery of gold. I was sitting one afternoon, said the captain, just after my siesta, engaged by the by in writing a letter to a relation of mine at Lucerne, when I was interrupted by Mr. Marshall, a gentleman with whom I had frequent business transactions, bursting hurriedly into the room. From the unusual agitation in his manner, I imagined that something serious had occurred. And as we involuntarily do in this part of the world, I at once glanced to see if my rifle was in its proper place. You should know that the mere appearance of Mr. Marshall at that moment in the fort was quite enough to surprise me, as he had but 2 days before left the place to make some alterations in a mill for sawing pine blanks, which he had just run up for me some miles higher up the Americanas. When he had recovered himself a little, he told me that, however great my surprise might be at his unexpected reappearance, it would be much greater when I heard the intelligence he had come to bring me. Intelligence, he added, which, if properly profited by, would put both of us in possession of unheard of wealth, millions and millions of dollars, in fact. I frankly own when I heard this that I thought something had touched Marshall's brain, when suddenly all my misgivings were put an end to by his flinging on the cable a handful of scales of pure virgin gold. I was fairly thunderstruck and asked him to explain what all this meant, when he went on to say that, according to my instructions, he had thrown the mill wheel out of gear to let the whole body of the water in the dam find a passage through the tail race, which was previously too narrow to allow the water to run off in sufficient quantity, whereby the wheel was prevented from efficiently performing its work. By this alteration, the narrow channel was considerably enlarged, and a mass of sand and gravel carried off by the force of the torrent. Early in the morning after this took place, Mr. Marshall was walking along the left bank of the stream when he perceived something which he at first took for a piece of opal, a clear transparent stone, very common here, glittering on one of the spots laid bare by the sudden crumbling away of the bank. He paid no attention to this, but while he was giving directions to the workmen, having observed several similar glittering fragments, his curiosity was so far excited that he stooped down and picked one of them up. "Do you know," said Mr. Marshall to me, "I positively debated within myself 2 or 3 times whether I should take the trouble to bend my back to pick up one of the pieces, and had decided on not doing so when further on another glittering morsel caught my eye, the largest of the pieces now before you. I condescended to pick it up, and to my astonishment found that it was a thin scale of what appears to be pure gold. He then gathered some 20 or 30 pieces, which on examination convinced him that his suppositions were right. His first impression was that this gold had been lost or buried there, but by some early Indian tribe, perhaps some of those mysterious inhabitants of the West of whom we have no account, but who dwelt on this continent centuries ago and built those cities and temples, the ruins of which are scattered about the solitary field. On proceeding, however, to examine the neighboring soil, he discovered that it was more or less auriferous. This at once decided him. He mounted his horse and rode down to me as fast as it could carry him with the news. At the conclusion of Mr. Marshall's account, and when I had convinced myself from the specimens he had brought me with him that it was not exaggerated, I felt as much excited as himself. I eagerly inquired if he had shown the gold to the work people at the mill, and was glad to hear that he had not spoken to a single person about it. We agreed not to mention the circumstance to anyone, and arranged to set off early the next day for the mill. On our arrival, just before sundown, we poked the sand about in various places, and before long succeeded in collecting between us more than an ounce of gold, mixed with a good deal of sand. I stayed at Mr. Marshall's that night, and the next day we proceeded some little distance up the South Fork and found that gold existed along the whole course. Not only in the bed of the main stream where he had subsided, but in every little dried-up crack and ravine. Indeed, I think it is more plentiful in these latter places. Ravine. For myself, with nothing more than a small knife picked out from a dry gorge a little way up the mountain, a solid lump of gold which weighed nearly an ounce and a half. I picked out from dry gorge. So a little way up the mountain, so he found gold. Okay. Notwithstanding our precautions not to be observed, as soon as we came back at the mill, we noticed by the excitement of the working people that we had been dogged about, and to complete our disappointment, on one of the Indians who had worked at the gold mine in the neighborhood of Ispas, cried out and showing to us some specimens picked out by himself. Specimens picked out. Oro. Okay. So we're gonna stop here. So this was written by Captain Sutter. Thank you guys. This is Gold Fever. I'll see you guys later. My page is facebook.com. YOSALLPLAY.